Welcome everybody to episode number 14, or sorry, 18 for Eat, Learn, and Grow with Tinhorn. I am Tinhorn and I'm Yavapai, Navajo, and Chinese, originally from Peach Springs, Arizona, and I own Tinhorn, where we are celebrating a decade of creating connections within our tribal communities. And if I can, actually, I'm going to mute everybody for right now. So at Tinhorn, we are the fluent speakers of the global language of technology. And at our core, we come from a computer programming foundation where we translate tech jargon to make this digital experience easier for you. Our team of consultants has over a combined 25 years of education and experience in computer science, computer engineering, social media, and web copy. Just bring us your challenges and we will help you set goals, and we see possibilities where others see roadblocks. Tinhorn is a 100% owned Yavapai woman-owned business, and we were recently recognized as the top 10 native STEM businesses to watch by the American Indian Science and Engineering Society for this year. And we're a past Business of the Year award recipient from the American Indian Chamber of Commerce of Arizona. So we encourage you to be a part of the discussion, and definitely to follow us and continue the engagement on our social media channels on Facebook and LinkedIn and Instagram. And also now we have a YouTube channel. So Eat, Learn, and Grow was born from really a need. You know, when the pandemic hit mid-March, and all our functions were getting closed down, we weren't able to physically connect, but humans, we need this connection. And so it's been a heart effort to create this space for us to gather online. And our thought was, you know, on a Friday afternoon during lunchtime, just grab your lunch and we can gather together, get a couple of experts to share their experiences and stories on different topics. And then the best part has been to have these open conversations with each other, since, you know, we would normally do this maybe at conferences or meetings, but now, you know, we're just transitioning to making this space online. And with that being said, October, I remember hearing the news, you know, that different states had recognized October 12th as Indigenous Peoples Day, and for Arizona, we recognized it this year. And so it got me thinking, like, you know, what does it even mean to be Indigenous in 2020? I think about when I was younger, like, you know, with my mother, I grew up on the Yavapai Indian Reservation. And so I grew up knowing myself as Indian. You know, that was the word we used for each other's. And then, you know, getting into transitioning to college, that was the first time I really heard people start using the term like natives or Native American. And more I was hearing my peers, you know, they weren't even introducing themselves as Native. They would just say like, I'm Yavapai, or I'm Navajo, or I'm Yavapai. And so when I think about that word Indigenous, I think about it really in terms of our identity, and what that can mean not only to ourselves and how we value and view ourselves, and then we influence, you know, our family, whether we're mothers, fathers, aunties, uncles, grandmas, grandpas, brothers, sisters, cousins, friends. You know, I think about that in terms of our identity. I think of it in terms of language, our culture, you know, the way popular culture, business. I mean, it affects every aspect of our lives. So that's what I wanted to talk about. It came to a head for me this past year. I'm the community advisor for the Mr. and Miss Indian ASU pageant committee, and so the prior ones who are preparing for this, the current ones, they really did not like that term Indian, Mr. and Miss Indian Arizona State University. And I just listened to a lot of their discussions, and they're like, we're Indigenous. So they actually changed the name, and it had to go up, you know, the ASU chain of command, and they're now Mr. and Miss Indigenous at Arizona State University. So you can't tell me that a word doesn't have power behind it. So with that, let's go ahead and open up. The flow for today will be, we have three amazing panelists who are going to share their stories. So I'll start with the first one, ask you a question. They'll answer it, and then we'll open it up to the group for discussion. And then we'll move it to the second panelist. She'll answer the question. We'll open it up for discussion again. And then we'll conclude with our third panelist who will share his experience, and that'll spark some great dialogue and discussion. I just want to encourage everybody that, again, this is a space for us to connect and to just feel connected to each other and not so alone at this time. So if your bandwidth allows it, flip on your video so we can have our little virtual talking circle here. You're more than welcome to ask questions by unmuting yourself or using the chat button. But first, I would like to introduce Dylan BACA, and he's going to be our first panelist. He is White Mountain Apache and Navajo. He is the current president of the Indigenous Peoples Initiative, and he's entering his, he is in his senior year at Blue Ridge High School in Arizona. And he is a very strong advocate for social change, and he's committed to eliminating social inequities. So Dylan, if you can, will you unmute yourself, and what does being Indigenous mean to you in 2020?
So first of all, thank you, April, for the introduction. The question is complicated, and there's many nuances to the word Indigenous. I'll use the example of my great-grandmother. She was born in 1923, a year before all Native Americans were considered citizens of the United States, and over a little over 40 years before all Native Americans received the right to vote in 1965. We've seen Native Americans have been disproportionately affected by laws within the United States, and even we see that when you travel to a reservation and see the lack of infrastructure, the lack of the ability to succeed, the lack of opportunity, and all those things compiled together has affected Native Americans disproportionately to our other fellow brothers and sisters of different races and ethnicities. So when we look at the term Indigenous, it is a relatively new term compared to the expansion of the history of Native Americans. At one time, it was Indian was the nomenclature, and we kind of got that from stereotypes, really. Hollywood contributing to that, print media, that was the nomenclature at one time. And then we transfer into a broader understanding of a community of people and how we're all kind of connected. Really, Indian is kind of considered derogatory because it refers to Indian people from Eastern Asia, not Native Americans from the continental United States. Really, even within that, the United States or South America, North America in general, and all those islands and so forth. So really, the term Indigenous is something that tries to incorporate more unity and understanding between different communities and working together. It's more inclusive than Indian or Native American. So really how we see it, so my organization and myself, is really a word of inclusion.
Like that. So Dylan, can I peel some more of that onion, and just, I'm curious because I'm thinking about, you're a senior in high school, and what your experience I know would definitely be different than mine, because I think I was a senior in like 90, 91, 92. So that I'm just curious, like, what does your experience, what is it like to you to be Indigenous like today?
It's complicated. I come from a biracial background. I am White Mountain Apache, Navajo, but I'm also half white as well. So, and I don't look particularly Native American in the sense that what people's perception of what Native American looks like. So I get to kind of walk this borderline of living in both worlds. And people are very surprised when I say I'm Native American. Um, Really, I've been mistaken for Filipino in the past and all these other things, and that's interesting in itself. But really, I'm proud of my history, my culture, and it gives me an ability to express that, just not through our history, but also through my ideas, the ideas of my relatives and so forth. And then I also get to connect with people because I have this perspective of two different worlds. It gives me a better understanding of both. So.
Mhm. So true. I can relate to being biracial because I grew up on the Yavapai Indian Reservation, and uh, I didn't move there till I was like in kindergarten. And I know the community I moved into, they let me know very much so that I was different. They're even as kids, we can detect the littlest things. And I remember like a nickname for me was China Doll growing up. And I always wondered that. I'm like, where does that come from? I'm Wallapai, I'm Navajo, I'm Chinese, but that was what was picked up on. And going back to identity, I've lived like out in Maryland. I went to grad school at Johns Hopkins, and I remember a lot of folks I met out there. They were like you exist, like the like Santa Claus or a bunny rabbit, or like they didn't think we existed anymore. And so, they had all these questions. And in the beginning, I was glad that they felt comfortable enough to ask. But then after a while, it's like, wow, is that my lot in life, is to always educate and bring awareness, and where does that burden rest on other people to educate themselves? Because like, when I traveled to like Mongolia, I did research on them before I went there because I was going into their culture and I didn't want to do anything offensive without knowing. And then, like being in different places throughout the world, it's interesting for people to mirror back, I guess, their experiences and what they see you, because we want to kind of compartmentalize and um, to be able to make sense of the unknown. We use what we know, and so that's an interesting topic. So I want to open it up to the group. We're here on the call. What does being Indigenous mean to you in 2020?
Yeah, I think for me, it means being a representation of those that came before you,
Mm,
and trying to continue the traditions and the cultural aspects that we were taught, um, and to make sure that those continue in the future. Um, that's, I think, for me, the biggest part is of me saying I'm Navajo, and I don't look full Navajo either, but I am. And a lot of times people think I'm Hispanic or Samoan or other things, but I'm full Navajo, and I grew up like in a really traditional household. So a lot of my life is based on my grandparents' teachings, and I base a lot of my decisions on kind of like I still hear their voices and what they taught me. So it's kind of my guideline to life. So to me, just maintaining that and keeping the traditions going is what it means to me.
that's powerful. I think growing up, if we don't know if we don't know who we are, I always think of like Higher Learning. I think it was the movie Higher Learning. Remy, this kid, who didn't know who he was and goes to college, and he keeps trying to fit in with all these different groups, skinheads and jocks and black fraternities, and he's just so desperate to belong. And I think that's the biggest thing with you know um, being Indigenous, knowing who you are, whatever that experience is for you, to me, it gives a sense of security of knowing no matter what happens, like you can always go back to your foundation. And I think I think about that for my daughter, because I think that's how gangs happen, or just people are looking for places to belong if they don't know. So I saw Kathleen, you unmuted yourself.
Oh, okay. I don't really have an answer as what it means to be Indigenous. I'm looking for that for myself because I am Cheyenne River Sioux on my mother's side. All of us are enrolled members. And as you can see, I don't have a huge blood quantum. I mean, you would never know that I have Lakota blood. There was a really interesting conference or session at the ACES, the American Indian Science and Engineering Society's national conference. It was last week. And it was it touched on this very subject. Two members of the Council of the Elders presented, and one of them said the first thing that you need to know concerning tribal membership, the future of being part of a tribe, he said blood quantum is unsustainable. It's not going to happen. Everybody's going to disappear if you say, oh, you've got to be half or full or a fourth even. Your tribe will cease to exist. And it's something that I have noticed or thought of for a while, and it really plays into the whole agenda behind having blood quantum, because the US government had this agenda that Native cultures were going to disappear over time. And so do tribal nations really want to play into that? I have to think no. But then it means that each tribe needs to define for itself, what does it mean to be one of us? Mm-hmm. And they said that this presents a real opportunity for each nation to determine what that means. So I just want to put that out there. I don't have the answers. I think the language is a really big part of it. And I came away from the conference with more determination to learning what I can of my tribe's language, even though I really don't have many people to speak it with close by. And trying to learn the customs, although I wasn't raised around it. So I'm having to make up a lot of lost time, trying to do what I can for to further the interests and address the issues facing Indian country with my skills and my talents. However I can contribute and have an impact. So.
Thank you for sharing that, Kathleen. And I think that's an interesting segue as well, talking about what does it mean to be Indigenous? And then you brought in, blood quantum. And I always joked for scholarship programs, like for people of color, there'd be like Blacks and Latinas and all other people of color. And I'm like, I'm the only person in this circle who had to provide papers to prove who I am, what I say I am. And I was like, if we had like a purebred dog, they'd be the second one. So I find that interesting that, we're us and dogs are the only ones who have papers to prove what we are. But we, like you said, can be a mindset change. And I know an example is with our tribe, it went to vote about 2-3 years ago about blood quantum. For Yavapai, it's a quarter. You need to be a quarter Yavapai to be enrolled. And the 3 options were, we're just going to do a hard reset, and everyone who's a tribal member today all becomes full bloods. And then another option was to lower it from a quarter to an 1/8. And I think the third option was actually just to let it remain the same. And so there wasn't well, the majority, barely the majority, was just to leave it the same. So I think that's going to continue to be an issue, as because we can't inbreed, to keep our blood quantums up. So, but I also thought what you were talking about too, Kathleen, is a great segue to our next presenter, our panelists, and that's going to be Lisa Wathogoma, and she'll be sharing her views. She is Hopi and Yavapai Apache and a mother of a young daughter. And she has recently created the Indigenous Woman, Not Your Average Warrior podcast, and that's premiering November 16th, 2020. And she is a former nonprofit administrator worker for 9 years in the healthcare field. And with that, I'd like to ask you, Lisa, what does being Indigenous in 2020 mean to you?
Well, thank you, April, and thank you for inviting me, first of all, to be on Eat, Learn, and Grow. And it's been a crazy year in 2020 with everything that's been going on with the pandemic. It's probably allowed a lot of people to think more, especially with the election too that's coming up. But for me, my personal views on it is kind of complicated, like Dylan said. I myself didn't grow up on the reservation. I grew up in New Mexico, in Albuquerque, and so my tribal home is in Arizona. So I was kind of pulled away from that at a young age, at about 3 or 4 years old. Occasionally would come back to the reservations, for ceremonies, but didn't really have that time to stay on the res and, learn the culture, get to meet the people, spend time with the elders. And that's one thing that I really kind of regret in a way now that I'm an adult and have a daughter, because she is intermixed as well. She's, I'm Yavapai Apache and Hopi, and she is part Anglo and Puerto Rican. So in a way, she is Indigenous in more ways than one, and I want her to be able to know her identity. And for me, I don't know how to speak my language. I don't even know how to introduce myself in my native language. And even when I was younger, I really never had an interest in it, because I didn't think of myself as being Native American, if that makes sense. Because a lot of my friends were Anglos or Mexicans or Hispanics. Or African American. So I wasn't really exposed to the native cultures, although New Mexico has a lot of pueblos, and I used to go to a lot of the festivals within those pueblos, but it just seems just so foreign to me. But now that I'm older and people are asking me, are you Hispanic? Are you Latina? Or they talk to me in Spanish. I'm like, no, I'm not. I'm not that. I'm Native American. And they're like, oh, are you Navajo? No, I'm not Navajo. But it's just like getting people to realize that there's more diverse cultures in being Native American than just one tribe. And I think a lot of people assume that. And just because you like Kathleen says, just because you don't look like a certain or fit a certain profile of what a Native looks like, people kind of categorize you. So being Indigenous just means knowing who I am, knowing my culture, and knowing my heritage and my roots. And the other day I was actually asking my father, who is Yavapai Apache from Clarkdale, I was asking him, how do you say hello in Yavapai? And he's like, oh, it's Gamu. I was like, April uses that, so April's Wallapai. He's like, yeah, they're pretty related. I'm like, okay, so me and April might be related. But I asked him, well, how do you say this, or how do you say that, like different phrases? And he goes, you know what, I don't know. I never learned very many, phrases. And I said, well, is there anybody in our family that speaks, Yavapai? And he said, no, there's really nobody. So I'm like, okay, like Kathleen said, who do I go to learn my language? And the same as on my mother's side, who's Hopi, just trying to ask around who knows the full language. And my grandmother doesn't, because her and her siblings were sent off to boarding schools, and so that it kind of took their identity from them of speaking their languages. And so it's just kind of like starting all over, like Kathleen had mentioned, starting all over again from the bottom and trying to figure out what my culture is ultimately. So, but to me, Indigenous is who I am. I am Indigenous, and you can't take, like you said, April, you can't take that away from me, even if my blood quantum says I'm only a quarter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for being really just vulnerable with us on that, because that's I know that's difficult to say to other people. And I grew up in a Christian home as well. So even though I grew up on the res, that wasn't really, like, my grandma didn't speak to me either in Yavapai. When people came to the house, because she had visitors every day, she was known for her homemade pastries, and come to her house, and you always would get coffee and a homemade pastry. So we had a lot of people come through and spill the tea with her, and they would be talking in Yavapai, but she would always talk to me in English. And I remember asking as an adult, my mom, like, why didn't grandma ever talk to me in Yavapai? And then she just said, because she told my mom when she was younger, she's like, knowing Yavapai is only going to hurt you. So you only are going to learn English because that's what you need to be able to make it in the world. And that was my grandmother's experience, So it's interesting how things skip generations or they change, because my daughter, who's 8, literally yesterday, she pulls out a Yavapai book, and it's all about relatives. And so it's like, your Gora, your Dala, all your relatives in Yavapai. And she sits down with me, and because I told her we're going to start reading. So we started, and she doesn't hear Yavapai daily either. And she just starts reading it, and I thought that's so cool. Like, one, she has no self-editing or shame, or, because no one's ever mocked her for trying to, pronounce a Yavapai word. She just wanted to read a book, and she's like, oh, that's she's like, Gora, that's my grandma, right? And so I thought that was cool, that now what my grandma had told me, it would only hurt me to learn Yavapai, and now I have what would be her great granddaughter is, wanting to just learn on her own. So I think that's cool. But I would like to open it up to discussion now, based on some of the conversation we had. What has been your experience? What does being Indigenous mean to you?
April, this is Jonathan. First of all, I want to thank Dylan and Lisa for sharing your stories. Thank you so much. They're very powerful and empowering. For me, being Indigenous is kind of a culmination of what everyone is talking about, whether it's learning your language or living your heritage. I grew up on the San Carlos Apache Reservation, and that's actually where I am now. And I didn't grow up speaking my language. I mean, of course, I knew some of the swear words and the naughty words that we weren't supposed to say. And but very similar to April, my grandmother told my parents not to teach us Apache. They wanted us to speak English so that we could not have any struggles that maybe she faced, and also maybe that some of my parents faced. But more recently, I was living in an Eastern European country for just over 2 years, doing some volunteer work there. And while I was there, I learned the language within a 3-month span, where I was starting to do conversational and then have full conversations and even trainings in the language. And then because of the pandemic, I did come home to San Carlos, where I'm actually staying and living with my mom, which I love the family time. And then she did ask me, she's like, so you speak the language over there, how was it? I was like, yeah, well, I'm starting to lose it because I don't speak it as often. And then she said, well, why don't you speak our language as much? I was like, well, I don't know. She said, if you can learn their language within a 3-month span, why don't you learn ours? So in April, when you said book, I went down to my bag because I do have a Western Apache to English dictionary that one of my friends gave me, and I use that now. So that's how I'm learning our language, and every now and then I will talk to or speak with my mother or my aunties, and even my cousin who's fluent will just text each other in Apache. So I really appreciate that opportunity, and for me, it's right now is connecting with my language and then learning my heritage, because prior to being brought home due to the pandemic 6 months ago, I didn't live on my reservation for over 20 years. I lived in the Phoenix, Scottsdale area, but I would still come home and visit. My parents live here. My family lives here. I would come, and I was involved in different board activities on my reservation. So I was definitely involved, but I didn't live here until recently. And now I'm living and working here and learning, I guess, relearning the language from before. So to me, I think that's part of my identity and being Indigenous.
Thank you for sharing your story too, Jonathan. Dang, moms will just tell you straight up, huh?
Right. I mean, I know how to make fry bread and tortillas, and I can cook. So that's half of it is food, I think, is Indigenous food.
Remember that episode on, was it that Padma's Travels when she was showing Indigenous Apache food?
Right, right.
Yeah, that's cool. And how about would anyone else like to share what being Indigenous means to you? Okay, well then we're going to transition to our third panelist today, and rounding up this amazing trio is a good friend, Justin DEEGAN, and he is a Rikara and Oglala Hunkpapa. You let me know if I said that wrong. Originally from the MHA Nation in North Dakota, and he owns Thunder Revolution Studio LLC. He some interesting tidbits about Justin, because we go way back to when we were teens, is that he was part of the United National Indian Tribal Youth Incorporated, and he spoke in front of Congress at the age of 19. He received a degree in political science from North Dakota State University in Fargo, North Dakota. And I like this one. This guy has the ultimate beat up res pickup truck with a amazing sound system featuring 10-inch subs and amps. You and my younger brother Tyler would get along great. He had this little beat up little res ride, and I remember when he came to pick me up one time, and the whole back of his car was like his woofer, and I was like, dude, your speaker's worth more than your ride.
That's exactly my scenario right now.
So Justin, what does being Indigenous mean to you?
Man, I think I've been thinking about that for the past few days. You know, how am I going to answer that question? Because being Indigenous in 2020 encapsulates so much right now in this time period. You know, there's like so many things that we could address and discuss regarding indigeneity through all of our intertribal relations throughout the United States, but not only just there, but it's also going up into Canada, South and Central America, you know, and because Indigenous people populate the entire Western Hemisphere. And so, you know, reflecting and thinking about that question, I've been really stuck, not really stuck, but just steeped in a lot of research regarding my own tribal history, regarding the history of the Mandan Hidatsa Rikara Nation and the other tribes within North Dakota and the borders of, you know, South Dakota, Montana, Minnesota, Wyoming, and those regions, just in our region alone, you know, and learning about, you know, the Fort Laramie Treaty and how it relates to constitutional law, you know, and how it relates to tribal law and federal state laws, and realizing that, you know, coming to, you know, back to my days of unity, back to my days of working on Capitol Hill, I'm reflecting on those conversations that I've had with other people, like former Representative Kildee. He was talking to me about sovereignty, you know, and in one of our conversations, he said that people only think that there are two sovereigns, which is the federal and the state. But what they don't realize is that the third sovereign is tribal. And that's what gets a lot of people, because they only believe there's just two. And it has a lot to do with the work that was put in and the huge amount of sacrifice that was laid before us. You know, the huge sacrifice of having to endure assimilation, having to endure all of those tactics of erasing us and erasing our culture and our history, our language, our songs, our dances, our foods, our organic way of life has really been bombarded by this systematic tactic of annihilation. And reflecting about to what Kathleen was talking about, because it has so much to do with our identity, with what everyone else is discussing right now, like Lisa and Jonathan and you is talking about identity, because it has to go back to this issue of genocide, and reflecting about who is Indian and who isn't Indian, or who is Native or who isn't Native, who's Indigenous, who isn't Indigenous, who can speak the language more and who can't. And then there's all of this lateral oppression going on in all these different directions. I was working with this woman a while ago, and I recorded this amazing stuff, and it was completely in her language. I mean, and then I had to go back for a second session just to sit down with her and get it all interpreted, and then have it all transcribed in her language and then in English, word for word. And it was powerful. It was really powerful. And the one thing that really stuck with me was when she said, the reason why I'm able to speak this is because my grandmother, that's all she spoke. And she would speak English to me, but I was there to hear it. And pretty soon it just became automatic where I could understand it. And I was like, well, how did that influence you? She said, well, my grandmother told me that when she was at boarding school, she said, I remember the story. She said they were over at the boarding school, and her friends, of course, they were chastised and interrogated for speaking their language and so on and forth. We all know those stories. The hair was cut and everything else. And I'm not trying to downplay any of that, because it's all traumatic. But she was talking about her grandmother and her friends. There were 3 other young girls who would at night sneak out of their bunks and go into the basement and secretly speak each other's language to each other so that they would not forget it. And that was their form of resistance. That was their way of ensuring that their language survived. And then that's why she could speak that language fluently, because of her grandmother. And now, you know, even today at this very moment, there are people within her own tribe who are saying, you don't speak the right language. You know, you're not saying it good enough because you're not saying it my way. But not realizing that, you know, there are basically 4 or 5 different sects of organizations within that tribe alone. And they had different villages set up and separated from each other. And so, I mean, even that type of lateral oppression, you know, you witness, and it's really disheartening. But what's powerful is the fact that she's still passing that language on to her grandchildren now. And that's the part that has really stuck with me, because of what we're talking about and how it relates to identity, you know. And one thing that, you know, I think what is important is because of the education that we have learned from, that was forced upon us, is that we become to realize that we can identify what those traumas are. We can identify what those hurts are. We can identify what those shortfalls are within our generation. And we could say, yeah, you know what? We realize that, but we know where we can do, we know what we can do and what we can't do. And we're going to address it, and we're going to learn our language. You know, we're going to, even if it's just a little bit, you're still learning your language. Even if you just have what you feel like is just a tiny amount of blood in your system, you're still indigenous. You're still your tribe. You're still a survivor of that genocide, that systemic genocide that's been happening all of these years. We're still here and we ain't going nowhere. You know what I mean? We're still going to be perpetuating our way of life in whatever way or fashion or form it is. And realizing that because of the blood quantum of, you know, that American pedigree is what I like to call it, because they pedigree us. You know, we're pedigreed with, you know, American pedigree is, you know, animals, dogs, horses, and Indians, right? Nobody else. And so because of that mathematical genocide, the eventual and gradual erosion of indigenous bloodlines that are flowing through our system, we realize that there is a mathematical genocide. And if we don't address it and say, look, we need to pivot, we need to, you know, move a different direction, because we can have like 16 different native bloodlines flowing through our blood, but we would only be recognized as that 1/16 of a bloodline. That's it. You know, so we have to realize, and we have to say, okay, we need to come to consensus right now, because, you know, people are trying to take the land. They're trying to take our natural resources. They're trying to push us away to the corner of the earth again. You know, up in my tribe, we're oil, you know, resources are off the charts, you know. And so all these conglomerates, international conglomerates are on our reservation now, just sucking the life's blood out of the earth, you know, and you know, some tribes and some people are, you know, financially benefiting, but the majority of us we don't see any of it, you know. So, and that's another thing that we need to do, to realize that we have to figure out how we're going to exist upon once all of that's gone within my tribe, you know. But, you know, reflecting upon everything within 2020 as an indigenous person is having time to sit down and look at the life's work of our ancestors and say, okay, you know, I realize and I get it, because now I can sit down and reset and recharge and look at those things that I never had time to look at. You know, you held your book up earlier, and I've been reading this. You know, I've been extrapolating a lot of information out of this, and this relates to the Arikara people in my tribe. And this here is volume 2, volume 2, and there's a lot of stories in these textbooks that are transcribed and completely in Arikara 100%, and then it was, you know, translated. And I'm amazed that even back then that they were thinking of us now in our generation, in our time. So, you know, being indigenous in 2020 has really opened my eyes to a lot of different things, and has really much like everybody else, is giving us the opportunity to reconnect with people like you, April, and opening this platform for us to have this time to connect and share our stories. So thank you.
Thank you, Justin. I appreciate you putting that historical context in here as well. And maybe what, four minutes?
Yeah.
So since we're showing books, I was like, get your book, Zoe. So this is what we were reading yesterday. That was her Yavapai relative one. And kind of cool, her uncle's the illustrator for it too. Man, that's so with all that being said, I know we still have some time left. I want to open it up to just general discussion. You know, we have so many different perspectives here. The first thing I think about is, you know, listening to people share their views on what it means to be indigenous in 2020, is that it's not homogenous. You know, we all have our own experiences, and I think it's human nature to want to make things you know, to simplify, but we're just so varied and layered and have so much depth, and that's great. I think that's a part of our survival and, the thriving of us as Indigenous people. And, I think about what, with the beginning of this discussion, what can we do moving forward? I think that's kind of the tie-in to me, like with Dylan. He's put to action, at a senior in high school, and has Indigenous Peoples Day. His group was a big part of it getting formally recognized by the state. So as a group here, what are calls to action? Because I do believe we have responsibilities to, like those three grandmas who met in the basement, and learned their language. I'm like, yikes! That makes me feel like I feel more that I'm not doing my part when I think about that. So I don't know, Dylan, do you have? I know we've kind of had talked about some calls to action when I was talking to you earlier, even about, like, I'm part of a national women business organization that is comprised mostly of non-women of color business owners. So I asked him, because the group asked me, they're like, how can we support this Indigenous peoples movement? And so if you want to share some thoughts to kick off another conversation with calls to action, that would be amazing.
Right. And so just the recognition of Indigenous peoples alone is really helpful. That's why our organization started working on replacing Columbus Day with Indigenous Peoples Day. So we've currently enacted legislation both at the state and federal level. And we're currently working with Congresswoman Holland Davids and Torres, as well as 25 others on legislation this coming session. So that's pretty exciting. So that recognition alone, that day, we see it as, we know it's not going to fix issues within reservations or anything, but the recognition alone gives us a seat at the table, gives us the ability to bring our voices into the conversation, illustrate our history, and understand that we have a history. There's been this notion that we've been erased in history and really written off as no longer existent within it. And that's a difficult thing to come back from, almost complete erasure of us, to try to bring back some existence. So that's important, acknowledging that whose land you're on, what specific tribes your land is on. That's really important. And working with Native Americans and to understand their background, the land that they occupy, and really it gives us an opportunity to understand ourselves and others better. So that's why it's just so important that we work closely with our Indigenous communities to ensure that we have success and that we are seen as existent in the future. It's been difficult. I was in a history class, was considered an advanced placement class, but we didn't even touch on the subjects of really Native Americans occupying the land prior to the discovery. Really, it was those issues of trying to erase Native Americans. So the Indian Removal Act, when President Jackson was president. So there's just those things that we touch on. So it's important that we have this contemporary history and story of Native Americans so people understand we are still here, we're still living, we're still existent.
Thank you for that. I almost want to say, I know we can't touch, but I almost want to do like, hug me, I'm Indigenous pins, eh? And I think about, when you speak of like being almost written off or invisible, and even in our history classes, I think of the work that like Roshan and Justin are doing, they're in media. It's really important, I think, for all of us to show the positive imagery of and effects of what we do. And I'd love to, I've never seen any of your films, Justin, so I could, the interview you spoke of, how would we view that?
Well, that was the audio recording. So and the reason why it's so fresh in my mind is because we I've been working with Interpretive Center, Indigenous Interpretive Center for about 2 years now. And I've been collecting stories and both, strictly verbal as well as, hold up, am I still on? Okay. So yeah, I've been doing a lot of oral history work within the last 2 years. And that's where a lot of that, the oral history stuff, and that one was all audio. It was just complete audio at that person's request. So, and that's what really made that subtle nuance of storytelling really powerful and touching for me, because it's all in your mind, and you're picturing it as it's happening. So your own imagination is like going in different directions with that recording, and it's really powerful for me. And as far as other works that I'm doing now, so we're rounding out the tail end of a film festival run, and I'm wearing a T-shirt. We were at Lumbee Film Fest in North Carolina, and so I screened both of my films, a full feature documentary called Another Scar of Genocide, which is about diabetes in Indian country. And that's a story about an Indigenous fashion designer and how she uses her fashion wares as a vehicle to bridge awareness about the issues of diabetes and breast cancer. So that's what that project's about. And then the second project is a short film called Totems. And that's just a story about two guys who are wandering the streets of Seattle, and they just kind of bump into each other. And that one's in black and white. And right now, both of the films will be screening at the Red Nations Indian Film Festival. And that's in LA. So, and I can post a link later on and share that with you or wherever, and then you guys can check it out and watch the screening live anywhere you're at, because it's a virtual film fest this year. So, and that's another thing about being Indigenous in 2020 is figuring out how to pivot in these times of uncertainty, you know what I mean? So yeah, so that's some of the work. And then I have a Vimeo page, vimeo.com /Thunder Revolution. So some of my works are on there as well.
Okay, if you email that to us, we usually send a follow-up email after these sessions, and we can include that so everybody would be able to start following Thunder Revolution's work. And that's cool. How about you, Lisa, with your upcoming new baby, the Indigenous Woman podcast, Not Your Average Warrior? What can we expect from that podcast?
So my idea for that was just to spotlight Indigenous women and their telling their stories, not just like if they're an entrepreneur, not talking like mostly about their business, but I really want to showcase them and their struggles that they've endured. It could go into all different topics, but just really getting to know the woman herself, what she's gone through, how she's overcome different obstacles or challenges in the Native community and within, mainstream society, and just really having a voice or having a platform where Indigenous women can have a voice, because there's a lot of podcasts out there with women talking about women, but there's not really ones that focus on Indigenous women. Mm-hmm. So I really want to bring that forth and have that available to people to get to know the women behind the businesses, or behind if they're a change maker, policy maker, if they're just a social media influencer. People are making a difference, and a lot of people don't know the backstories of those individuals. So that's supposed to be premiering November 16th of this year, so basically in a month. So if you want to follow indigenouswoman.podcast on Instagram, you'll see more updates on that.
Sweet. And we'll also include that information in the same email along with the Indigenous Peoples Initiative. So you can follow all three of our panelists. And actually, I'll put in a plug too, if you don't already, can you also follow Tinhorn as well? We'll have that in the email. As I'm looking at our time, I don't want to single anybody out, but Miss Andrea, are you still with us and would you like to share? And Cody, I know that we hadn't heard from you if you'd like to about being what does being Indigenous in 2020 mean to you?
Hello. Well, I am here just listening. I am not Indigenous, so I am just listening to be more educated.
Ooh, love, love, love allies. So where do you come from, Andrea?
I live in Bismarck, North Dakota. I'm actually friends with Justin, so that's how I learned about this Zoom meeting.
Hey, all right. And that's another thing about being Indigenous in 2020 is we're everywhere, hey, without leaving our home now. I love that we're able to connect. So I haven't seen you, Justin, like we were talking about it for, I don't know, at least a decade, if not more. You know, I didn't even have Zoe yet. And so it's great that we're able to connect in this way. I think that being Indigenous in 2020 is owning our stories, owning our voice, owning our narrative. And I think for me, it's really just, it's not about externals telling me what being Indigenous is. In 2020, it's about the internal part for me. And that to me is empowerment, because then I'm not looking for the validation from other people telling me what is and what isn't. I think we're definitely in world history time. We're in one of those shifts right now. You know, like I almost was thinking about it. I was talking to my mom, and I was like, think about it like our ancestors when like the Black Plague hit, right? Or when like polio, or when the Europeans came over and, you know, we had smallpox, right? And then that was a lot of our ancestors were taken out. And, you know, I think about in our little community of less than 2,000 Yavapais, you know, we've lost 13 people already to the COVID disease. And so I'm thinking about that in terms of like, you know, those are like the historical or worldview timelines, like mile markers. And we are a part of that as Indigenous people. So my thoughts is like a time, like Justin said, to pause and to question everything that I've held as a truth, and to re-examine it. Does it still serve me or not? And is there a way to do things differently for a different result, but still to remain true to my values? But I think this is a great time to just let go of everything that hasn't served us well. You know, like the infighting, the lateral oppression, just all of that, like, let it go. Doesn't serve us anymore. And, you know, like the blood quantum, I think we could come up with way different metrics, if it even has to be a metric. You know, I remember a good 20 years ago, a great friend of mine from Seminole tribe, she talked about you know, why do we have to quantify ourselves? What if we just said, you know, she's like, there's going to come a time when you can have a full-blooded Native kid who's not enrolled anywhere, because they'll be all Native tribes, but not enough to meet any of the requirements to enroll. And she's like, are we going to say that they're not Indigenous, they're not Native, they're not, you know, Yavapai, Navajo, Hopi, you know? And I like that idea to just include like everything. So those would be my big picture ask of you, is to really examine during this time what really matters to you, and what really doesn't serve you. Like, let it go. And I think it's a great time for collaboration. So, you know, there's 9 of us here, if not more. I think there's so many different combinations of things that could happen that could be great for our communities. So with that, I would like to thank Dylan, Lisa, and Justin for sharing your stories and everybody else on the call who shared what being Indigenous means to you. If there's anyone else who'd like to close us out with one last thought, I'll open up the floor. You can just unmute yourself. Hey, Hollywood Squares. Well, with that being said, we will have this recording on Tinhorn's YouTube channel, and we'll have a follow-up email where you can have everyone's social media handles, and we will be coming back on, our next episode is the 3rd Friday of the month, so I believe that puts us at November 20th, and our topic will be on gratitude. So go ahead and mark your calendars if you'd like. And if you enjoyed this, I definitely ask you to follow Tinhorn if you don't already. So have a beautiful Friday, everybody. And
Thank you.
yes,
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Everybody take care.
Thank you.
Wopila.
Everybody. See everybody.